What if I told you that the man who won America's independence lost more battles than almost any victorious general in history? And what if the single boldest move he ever made was not a charge into glory, but the decision to turn and run? Let me take you back to Christmas night, in the year 1776. Picture a river choked with jagged slabs of ice, a black sky spitting sleet and snow, and 2,400 starving, half-frozen men climbing into narrow wooden boats in the dark. On the far side of that water, more than 1,000 hired soldiers lay fast asleep, warm and confident, sleeping off a long night of holiday feasting, with no idea that anything was coming for them. Within 90 minutes of the attack that followed, the whole thing was over. More than 900 prisoners taken. Not one American killed in the fighting. It was one of the most lopsided victories of the entire war for independence. And I want you to understand something right now, because it changes everything you think you know about how this country was born. This was not luck. This was not some desperate gambler rolling the dice one final time. This was the opening move of a strategy so unconventional, so deliberately deceptive, that the mightiest military on the face of the earth never once figured out how to answer it, until it was far too late. Over the next few minutes, I am going to walk you through the hidden playbook they never taught you in school. The one that turned a ragged band of farmers into the ghost that broke an empire. And it begins with a truth that almost no one ever talks about. But before we go any further, let me welcome you in. Thank you for being here with me today. And if you love the untold strategies and the forgotten turning points that shaped this nation, do me a favor and hit that subscribe button and turn on notifications so you never miss the stories that the history books left out. Now, let me take you to where all of this really began. The year is 1775, and the Continental Congress has just handed one man a job that no person in his right mind would ever want. They made him commander of the Continental Army. It sounds grand, doesn't it? It sounds like an honor. But you have to understand what that army actually was. It was not an army at all, not in any real sense. It was a loose, scattered collection of local militias with no unified training, no standard weapons, no dependable supply of money, and no guarantee that the men would even be there next month. And who were they up against? They were up against the single most powerful empire on earth. Let me give you the numbers, because the numbers alone should have ended this war before it started. The British Navy ruled the oceans with more than 270 warships. Their soldiers were professionals who had been drilling since they were boys. Their officers came from the finest military academies in all of Europe. And their treasury ran so deep that they simply hired 30,000 German mercenaries, most of them from a region called Hesse, and sent them across the sea to crush the rebellion. Now look at the other side of that scale. On our side, we had farmers. We had shopkeepers. We had teenage boys who had never once fired a musket at another living soul. And here is the part that still stuns me to this day. These men signed up for enlistment so short, sometimes as little as 90 days, that when their time was up, they simply picked up and walked home, no matter what was happening on the battlefield. Just imagine that for a moment. Imagine trying to win a war for the survival of a nation when your entire army evaporates every 3 months and you have to build a brand new one from scratch over and over again. By every measure that a general is supposed to care about, this war was already lost. So what did he do? He did the one thing that no one expected, and the one thing that almost no one around him could understand. He refused to fight the war the way everyone assumed it had to be fought. He called his approach a war of posts, and it came straight out of the pages of ancient history. You see, this was a man who had almost no formal schooling, who never learned Latin or Greek, and yet he had studied the old Roman historians closely, and he knew the story of a general who had faced an impossible enemy and lived to win. That ancient commander had saved Rome not by meeting his enemy in open battle, but by refusing to give him one. He shadowed the enemy, he cut the supply lines, he harassed and delayed and waited, and he let time itself do the killing. And that is exactly the logic our general now turned against the British Empire. Here is the heart of it, the idea that changes how you see this entire war. He did not need to win. He only needed to not lose. As long as his army stayed alive and stayed in the field, the revolution was still breathing. And every single day that the war dragged on, it cost the British a staggering fortune. Their supply line stretched nearly 3,000 miles across the Atlantic Ocean, and every month of fighting drained millions from their treasury and chipped away, little by little, at the willingness of their own government to keep paying the bill. Time was not on their side. Time was on ours. He understood that, deep in his bones, while the British generals, with all their training and all their aristocratic confidence, never saw it at all. Now, I want to be honest with you because this is important. This choice was lonely. It was so unpopular that even the leaders of our own cause turned on him. One of the most famous patriots of the age grew so frustrated that he openly declared he was sick to death of these delaying tactics at every turn. So picture the pressure on this one man, mocked by his enemies, doubted by his friends, deserted by his own soldiers, and carrying the entire future of a nation on his shoulders. To understand why he was willing to endure all of that, you first have to see the disaster that nearly ended everything, the day the revolution almost died in a single afternoon. In the late summer of 1776, everything that could go wrong did go wrong. On the fields of Long Island, the British commander outmaneuvered our forces on multiple fronts at once, sweeping around the flanks and very nearly pinning the entire Continental Army with its back against the East River. There were around 10,000 men holding that position, and the British overwhelmed them so completely that the war very nearly ended right there, in a single afternoon. Let me be clear about how close it came. If the British had pressed their advantage that evening, they almost certainly would have destroyed the rebel army for good, and there would be no United States for me to tell you about today. But then something happened that his critics have never given him nearly enough credit for. Overnight, a thick, heavy fog rolled in across the water, and under the cover of that fog, he organized one of the most remarkable escapes in military history. Using every single boat he could get his hands on, he quietly ferried 9,000 soldiers across the river, along with their horses, their cannon, and their supplies, and the whole operation took roughly 9 hours. Now here is the detail that gives me chills every time. The British sentries were posted less than 600 yards away from where our men were loading into those boats, and they never heard a thing. By the time that fog finally lifted and the enemy realized what had happened, the American army was simply gone. That retreat saved the revolution. But more than that, it taught him the lesson that would define the rest of the war. He could not beat the British in a straight fight. Not on an open field, not with formed ranks and bayonet charges, not with the men and the training and the supplies he actually had. So he stopped trying, and instead, he retreated. He retreated across New Jersey. He retreated through Pennsylvania. He retreated so many times that his own officers began to wonder, out loud, whether he had any intention of ever fighting at all. British generals mocked him in their letters home. Loyalist newspapers called him a coward and predicted the whole rebellion would collapse within weeks. And his army bled away, because men who had signed up to fight for freedom had not signed up to spend month after month walking away from the enemy. But I want you to see what he saw. He was not running scared. He was watching and waiting for the British to make the exact mistake he needed them to make. And they made it. Grown overconfident, certain the war was nearly won, they spread their forces thin across New Jersey in a chain of isolated little outposts and settled in for a comfortable winter. And that was the opening he had been waiting for. Now let me bring you back to that freezing Christmas night on the Delaware. Before his men ever stepped into those boats, he had a passage read aloud to them, words written by one of the great voices of the Revolution, words that began by saying, "These are the times that try men's souls." And then he gave them a password for the night ahead, a phrase that tells you everything about the stakes he understood. The password was, "Victory or death." The plan called for 3 separate crossings, but the river was so clogged with ice that 2 of the 3 never made it across. Only his column got through. Picture it. 2,400 men fighting the current for 9 long hours. In the dark, as massive slabs of ice slammed against the hulls of their flat little boats. They were carried across by a company of hardened fishermen and sailors who knew how to handle rough water. And when they finally reached the far shore, they still had a 9-mile march ahead of them through a howling snowstorm. Some of these men had no shoes. Their boots had worn through weeks earlier, and they left bloody footprints in the snow behind them. 2 of them lay down on that frozen road and never got up again. And yet, on they went. When they came down on the sleeping town just after daybreak, the enemy was caught completely, utterly off guard. And there is a reason for that, a reason most people never hear. Their commander had spent Christmas evening drinking late into the night at the home of the local postmaster. And in the days before, a spy planted in that very town, a man posing as a loyal butcher, had whispered to them that the American army was falling apart and in no shape to attack anyone. So they slept. They had even stopped sending out their nightly patrols because of the storm. When the attack came, their commander stumbled out to rally them, but it was already too late. He was shot from his horse and fell, mortally wounded, and only later would they find, tucked in his pocket, an unread warning that an attack was coming, a note that might have saved his life and the lives of hundreds of his men. In just 90 minutes, more than 900 of them surrendered. Among the handful of Americans wounded that morning was a young lieutenant struck by a musket ball, bleeding badly, whose life was saved only because a doctor clamped the artery in time. That young man would live to become the 5th President of the United States. And exactly 1 week later, our general was about to make the British look like fools all over again. Just days after that victory, the British sent one of their most aggressive generals marching south with more than 5,000 troops, determined to crush our small force once and for all. He arrived in the evening, found our army camped behind a creek, and decided to wait until morning to finish the job. He even bragged to his officers that he would bag the old fox at first light. But the old fox had no intention of being there at first light. All through the night, our general kept the campfires burning bright, and he left behind a small detachment of men whose only job was to feed those flames and to bang shovels against the frozen ground, as if they were digging in for a fight. And while the enemy watched those fires and listened to that noise, convinced the whole army was still in place, the real army was slipping away. They wrapped the wheels of their cannon in rags to muffle the sound, and they vanished down the back roads in the darkness. By dawn, the British attacked an empty camp. Our general had already marched 12 miles away and slammed into another British garrison, winning yet another quick, sharp victory. He had been dismissed as a beaten man hiding behind a creek, and he had just outsmarted the enemy twice in a single week. Now, these victories did wonders for morale. Enlistments picked up. The panic in Congress cooled. The revolution had a pulse again. But he was clever enough to know that these wins did not change the hard math of the war. The British were still stronger, still better supplied, and still in control of every major port along the coast. So he went right back to his patient, grinding approach, striking only when the odds favored him, and melting away whenever they tried to force a real fight. And that patience led him into the darkest chapter of the entire war. The winter that followed, his army settled into a camp roughly 20 miles from the enemy-held capital, and what happened there tested the absolute limits of human endurance. The men built their own crude log huts, packing 12 soldiers into a single shelter barely 14 feet by 16 feet. Food was so scarce that they survived on little more than flour and water, cooked into hard cakes on hot stones. And disease swept through that camp like fire. Roughly 2,000 soldiers died that winter, and here is the part that breaks my heart. Most of them did not fall to British bullets. They died of sickness and hunger in the cold, waiting. And yet, something extraordinary was taking shape inside that suffering camp, something the British never saw coming. A seasoned officer from Prussia arrived and began to drill those ragged troops with the discipline of the finest armies in Europe. Now, he could barely speak a word of English, and he had to give his commands through translators. There is a wonderful detail here that I love. When the men frustrated him, he would curse at them in German and in French, and then have an aide translate the curses into English so they would understand exactly how he felt. Nearly one-third of those soldiers did not even speak English as their first language. But it did not matter, because he led by showing them. He stood right there in the mud alongside the enlisted men, demonstrating how to hold a bayonet, how to march in tight formation, how to load and fire in coordinated volleys. The army that had limped into that camp was a collection of desperate amateurs. The army that marched out the following spring was a professional fighting force, and the training manual that officer wrote would guide the American army for decades to come. But discipline was only one of his secret weapons, because all this time in the shadows, he had been running something the British could never match. He was, in truth, obsessed with intelligence, and he built one of the most effective spy networks of the entire century out of ordinary civilians with no training at all. Deep inside the enemy-occupied city, a ring of shopkeepers, farmers, and merchants passed him a steady stream of secrets. They used a numbered code with 763 different combinations, where the number 711 stood for the general himself, 727 stood for the occupied city, and one number, 355, stood for a mysterious woman whose true name we still do not know to this day. They wrote their messages in invisible ink, brushed onto ordinary-looking letters that could only be revealed with a special chemical. One of the key agents ran a shop and simply gathered secrets by chatting with British officers who talked freely over their drinks, never once suspecting the quiet merchant across the room. Another operative used her laundry line as a signal system where a black petticoat meant a message was waiting, and the number of handkerchiefs told exactly where to find it. And here is what stuns me most. For 5 straight years, not a single one of those spies was ever caught, and the general himself never even knew their real names. But he did not just gather secrets. He manufactured lies. He had fake dispatches written up, describing armies that did not exist and reinforcements that were never coming, and then he arranged for those papers to fall right into British hands. The enemy poured enormous resources, chasing threats that lived only on paper. Years later, one British officer admitted the bitter truth of it. He said that they had not really been outfought at all. They had simply been outspied. And nowhere would that genius for deception matter more than in the single greatest trick of the entire war, the one that finally shattered the Empire's grip for good. By the summer of 1781, a British army of roughly 7,500 troops had marched to a small tobacco port on a narrow peninsula in Virginia, where they began digging in and waiting for supplies and reinforcements to arrive by sea. And our general saw an opportunity that might never come again in his lifetime. But there was a problem, and it was an enormous one. That British army sat about 350 miles to the south of where he was, just outside the enemy-held city in the north. If he simply marched his men south out in the open, the British commander in that city would see it coming in an instant, and would either rush reinforcements down by ship or strike at his weakened positions the moment his back was turned. So he needed the enemy to believe, with total and complete conviction, that the northern city was still his real target. And what he did next may be the single greatest military deception of the entire century. He ordered the construction of a massive fake camp across the river, complete with huge brick bread ovens large enough to feed an army for a long stay. He had his men build boats along the shore, as if they were preparing to storm the city by water. He wrote out detailed plans for an all-out assault, and made absolutely certain those plans fell into enemy hands. He even used a double agent, an enslaved man who had bravely volunteered to serve, to feed the British false reports that wildly exaggerated the strength of our forces in the South. Another soldier posed as a deserter and spread the lie that our troops had more than enough boats to trap them completely. And the British commander swallowed every bit of it. He pulled his forces in tight around the northern city and braced for an attack that was never, ever coming. Meanwhile, our real army, joined by roughly 4,000 French soldiers, was racing south at a speed that seemed impossible for that age. And there was one more jaw of the trap, closing out at sea. A French fleet of more than 24 warships swept into the bay and sealed off that peninsula from any hope of rescue. When a British relief fleet finally arrived, the French sailed out and beat them so badly that they were forced to turn back for repairs. And just like that, the trap was shut. That British army was now completely surrounded, cut off by land and by sea, with nowhere left to run. What followed was a relentless siege. Our guns and the French guns pounded their fortifications around the clock, day and night, tearing apart earthworks that had taken weeks to build. On one critical night, a young colonel who had been begging for a field command for years led his men against a key enemy strongpoint, and they took it in under 10 minutes, using nothing but bayonets, with their muskets unloaded, to keep the assault silent and swift. Trapped and desperate, the British commander made one final gamble. He tried to slip his men across the river at night to break out and escape. And then, as if the heavens themselves had chosen a side, a sudden and violent storm swept across the water, scattering his boats and driving his men back to shore. Whatever slim hope he had left disappeared into that storm. And so, on an October morning in 1781, a lone drummer boy appeared on the ruined ramparts, and the guns finally fell silent. More than 7,000 British soldiers marched out and laid down their weapons. When the news reached London, the Prime Minister is said to have paced the room, repeating over and over that it was all over. And he was right. But here is where the story takes a turn that almost no one talks about, and it may be the most important part of all. Because the war did not truly end with that surrender. 2 years later, our army, still unpaid after years of sacrifice, grew bitter and restless, and a dangerous plot began to spread through the ranks. There was open talk of marching on the government, of seizing power by force. And you have to understand what this moment truly was. If this one man had wanted to make himself a king, this was his chance. The army was loyal to him, and him alone. All he had to do was say the word. Instead, he walked into a room full of his angry officers, and he asked them to be patient, to trust the nation they had bled for. And then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a pair of reading glasses, spectacles that almost none of these men had ever seen him wear. And he said, quietly, that they would have to forgive him, for he had not only grown gray, but nearly blind in the service of his country. And in that instant, hardened soldiers who had faced cannon fire without flinching began to weep. The plot collapsed on the spot. And not long after, he did the most astonishing thing of all. He gave the power back. He resigned his command and went home to his farm. And when the King of England heard that the man who had just defeated him intended to simply walk away from power and return to his fields, he is said to have marveled that if he truly did that, he would be the greatest man in the world. So let me leave you with this. He did not win because he was the better battlefield tactician. He lost more fights than he won. He lost the great cities, one after another. But he understood, better than anyone alive, that this war was never about holding ground. It was about endurance. It was about deception. It was about making the enemy pay so dearly for every single mile that their own people finally refused to keep paying. He turned weakness into a doctrine. He turned retreat into a weapon. He turned a frozen river on Christmas night into the moment that saved a revolution. And in the end, he understood the deepest truth of all, that the real victory was not in seizing power, but in having the strength to lay it down. The British came looking for a conventional war. What they got instead was a ghost who would not stand still, who struck them while they slept, who fed them lies they believed with all their hearts, and who vanished every time they tried to corner him. And by the time they finally understood what he had been doing all along, the war was already lost. If this story opened your eyes to a side of our nation's birth that you never learned in school, I would love to hear your thoughts down in the comments, and please, share this with someone who ought to know it. Subscribe and stay with me, because we have many more untold stories still to come.